Signs. They warn you, inform you of potential hazards, and help guide you on the road to safety where you work. Getting on the road to safety at your workplace is like driving to a destination or traveling on a long trip. You rely on signs and symbols to guide and direct you. You're warned about the hazards of the road, and if you're unsure of where to go, you'll either reach for your map or at work, reach for a Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS, to find out more information, or perhaps ask your supervisor for directions. But not everyone seems to be on the safe road. Year after year, the Hazard Communication Standard, or HAZCOM, continues to be one of OSHA's most violated standards. The HAZCOM standard, mandated by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, requires your employer to inform you of the potential hazards in your workplace. This program will cover the training requirements of the HAZCOM standard, explain various physical and health hazards, and teach you how to use warning labels and MSDSs. Chemicals serve a variety of purposes at home or on the job. However, if they are misused, the consequences can be painful, even deadly. In your workplace, your employer will identify and compile a list of potentially hazardous materials that exist. Regardless of whether the material is imported or produced at your facility, if it's potentially hazardous, it must be identified as such in the form of warning labels and MSDSs. Materials can pose a range of hazards, often thought of as either physical hazards or health hazards, although a chemical can be both. Very simply, physical hazards act outside the body to produce a dangerous situation. For example, a flammable or explosive chemical poses physical hazards. Health hazards cause damage such as stomach aches, nausea, and even reproductive damage. But health hazards can be either acute or chronic. Acute health hazards do their damage quickly as a result of short-term exposure, such as respiratory problems caused from a chemical leak. Chronic health hazards occur gradually over time. For example, carcinogens and reproductive toxins are chronic health hazards. Knowing what hazards exist and how to protect yourself is part of the HAZCOM standards training requirements. Your employer must inform you of any operations in your work area where hazardous materials are present, and explain methods and observations that may be used to detect the presence or release of a hazardous chemical, such as monitoring. You'll also be informed of ways to protect yourself using safe work practices, personal protective equipment or PPE, and emergency procedures. Lastly, you will be informed of the location and availability of your employer's written hazard communication program. You'll be provided with the details of this program, including an explanation of the labeling system, material safety data sheets, and how to use this hazard information effectively. Your training will be updated whenever a new material is introduced into the workplace, and whenever any hazard regarding a material changes. It's important that you are trained for your safety and your co-workers' safety. Oftentimes, you will be interviewed during an audit or OSHA inspection to determine if your employer is adequately training you. You must be able to show a basic understanding of how the chemicals you work with can hurt you. On the road, you would never deliberately enter the wrong way. And in your workplace, you would never intentionally misuse a chemical. That's why you depend on labels to warn you about potential hazards. But what about when labels provide very little information? Or even worse, when labels aren't there? In this real-life situation, these workers had no warning at all. They were in a waste storage area of their plant, emptying a small container of what they thought was silver cyanide into a larger container of silver cyanide waste. Only later did they discover the smaller container held hydrogen peroxide, an oxidizer. As the chemicals were mixed, the drum's internal pressure rose rapidly. And suddenly, the drum burst. The workers were hospitalized for chemical burns and exposure to toxic fumes and smoke. As unfortunate as this incident was, these workers should have known not to mix any chemicals that are not properly labeled. That's why your employer ensures that labels are attached to almost every hazardous material in your workplace. Labels on containers of potentially hazardous material shipped to your workplace will be legible, prominently displayed, and include the following information: the identity of the chemical or chemical name, the appropriate hazard warnings such as flammability and explosive properties, and usually the name and address of the chemical manufacturer, importer, or other responsible party. If any of this information should change, your employer will make sure that the labels are updated. Never remove a label unless you immediately replace it with another one. Keep in mind that there are a few exceptions where labels are not necessary. For example, pipes do not have to be labeled because they aren't considered containers. But just because they aren't labeled doesn't mean you can assume the chemical inside is safe. Portable containers do not have to be labeled if the chemical was transferred from a labeled container and is immediately used by the employee who transferred it. Therefore, never leave an unmarked container of a hazardous material unattended. Likewise, if you find an unlabeled container of a material, never assume it's harmless just because it isn't labeled. Also, for individual stationary process containers, other signs, placards, process sheets, batch tickets, operating procedures, or other written forms may be attached instead of warning labels, but only under two conditions. 1. That the placard or other written method used identifies which containers the warnings refer to, and 2. That the written method used contains the same information that would be on a warning label, such as the physical and health hazards. Lastly, warning labels won't do their job unless you do yours. Pay attention to them. Just as you wouldn't ignore a stop sign, don't ignore warning labels. Sometimes warning signs just aren't enough. You need more detailed information. Your employer will provide material safety data sheets, MSDSs, for every hazardous chemical you work with. In fact, your employer will make sure that MSDSs are readily accessible during each work shift. You'll find just about everything you could possibly want to know about the safe handling of a material in an MSDS. But trying to use MSDSs regularly can often be frustrating. You can easily remember the information in the MSDS by grouping it into 4 main categories: product information, exposure situations, hazard prevention and protection, and other specific information. Your organization's MSDS may not follow this same order, but the principles for using the MSDS are the same. Basic information about the material, such as its name, the name, address, and telephone number of the manufacturer, and the preparation date or date of the last revision, can be found in the beginning of an MSDS. Keep in mind the chemical name will be the same as the one on the label, although other names may also be listed. Usually, emergency telephone numbers are listed as well. The ingredients of the material and their hazards will be listed in the beginning of an MSDS. But if the ingredients are trade secrets, they will not be listed. Only their hazards will be listed. Specific exposure limits that have been established for your safety are permissible exposure limit, or PEL, threshold limit value, or TLV, and short-term exposure limit, or STEL. The PEL and the TLV are maximum concentrations of the substance that you can safely be exposed to when averaged over an 8-hour workday. The short-term exposure limit, or STEL, is an acceptable concentration that you can safely be exposed to measured over a 15-minute period. Potential physical and health hazards of a material will be found in the beginning of an MSDS. For example, if a material is flammable, corrosive, or toxic, you will know by reading the MSDS. How these hazards can enter your body and how they will affect your health will be written here as well. For example, the primary routes of entry for this industrial cleaner are inhalation and skin and eye exposure. If exposed to this chemical, long-term health effects are not likely, but acute health effects are, such as reddening and irritation. In the event of an accidental exposure, first aid and firefighting measures are listed, as well as how to respond to a spill or leak. For example, if this industrial cleaner were spilled on the skin or in the eyes, the first aid section says to immediately begin decontamination with running water. For a fire involving this chemical, almost any kind of fire extinguishing agent can be used. MSDSs provide effective firefighting measures and list any unusual fire or explosion hazards. Some typical terms you'll find in the firefighting section include flammable limits, flash point, and auto ignition. The flammable limits provide a range of vapor concentrations in air that will produce fire when an ignition source is present. Usually there will be an upper explosive limit, or UEL, and a lower explosive limit, or LEL. Any concentration of a substance in air between these figures can produce an explosion when an ignition source is present. Any substance with a concentration above the UEL or below the LEL is less likely to ignite. The flash point is the lowest temperature at which a liquid gives off enough vapor to form an ignitable mixture with air and produce a flame when a source of ignition is present. Auto ignition is the temperature at which a material will spontaneously ignite or burn without an ignition source. Accidental release measures for spills or leaks are listed as well. The MSDS describes how to clean up the hazardous material. It is mainly designed for those trained in responding to emergency spills. Instructions on how to safely handle and store materials can be found in the MSDS. Following these instructions will minimize your direct contact with the material, reduce fire hazards or other reactions, and prevent release of the material. Conditions to avoid when storing chemicals like excessive heat, direct sunlight, or vibration will be covered as well. Other safe practices described include engineering controls such as ventilation and personal protective equipment, or PPE. For example, while handling hydrochloric acid during routine use, it is advised to wear splash goggles or safety glasses and rubber gloves. You'll also find the physical and chemical properties of a material, such as its appearance, evaporation rate, and melting and boiling points. By knowing the physical and chemical properties, you'll be better able to protect yourself. Other important characteristics listed include whether the material is stable or unstable, conditions and other materials that can cause dangerous reactions with it, and hazardous substances that may be released with decomposition of the material. Other specific information about a material, including toxicological, ecological, disposal, transportation, and regulatory information, is provided. This information is typically needed by specialists, such as emergency responders, physicians, or toxicologists. Although the MSDS is lengthy, it's fairly easy to remember, especially if you think of the four main categories: product information, exposure situations, hazard prevention and protection, and other specific information. An MSDS is like a roadmap. It shows you an overall view and includes precise markings, so you can get to where you're going easily and safely. For everyone's safety, look at the MSDS first, before handling a chemical. Under the HAZCOM standard, you have the right to know the hazards around you. If you're ever unsure about a chemical, ask your supervisor. It's similar to being lost. You refer to a map or ask someone for directions. By reading the warning labels, understanding MSDSs, and applying the training your employer provides, you will be on the road to safety.